Welcome back, Connecting Point. We are moving forward in our Judges. We're going to discuss Deborah this week from Judges chapter 4 and 5. Let's start with a reminder of how we got here. The author of Judges laid out a backdrop to the stories of the individual judges in chapter 2 with the sin cycle. Doug took us through that a couple weeks ago, where the Israelites would fall into a moral and spiritual corruption by seeking to be like foreign gods that were around them, rather than to follow Yahweh's call to the higher standard that he had laid out for them. Yahweh, in turn, allows them to receive the natural consequences. You want to follow after other gods? Well, now you can see what it's like to be ruled by them. This is one of the major themes in the book of Judges, that in this life, you will answer to someone. Is it going to be the God who loves you, the God who has the best in mind for you? Or is it going to be the rulers and powers of this world? Are you going to partner with God in the restoration of blessing and the eradication of evil? Or are you going to partner with evil and suffer the consequences? Then, when Israel gets sick of living under the oppression of a foreign ruler, they call out to Yahweh for deliverance. Yahweh then raises up a judge who brings peace until the next cycle starts. So we've seen this pattern already borne out a few times with some specific judges during this time period. We've talked about Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar, and today we're going to be talking about Deborah. So, though Othniel had set for us something of a template for the ideal judge, we find that the subsequent judges are all really unlikely candidates for leadership. We had Ehud, who was possibly disabled, or at least he was seen to be at a physical disadvantage to his contemporaries. Shamgar, who was not an Israelite. He was not part of the club. He didn't really fit in or belong. And he used unconventional methods. And then today we're going to discuss Deborah, who was a woman. She was a prophet, a judge, a military and spiritual leader. But being a woman in this time period was not easy. You were often treated like property. So it's really significant that she was a woman, and that really stands out for us in the book of Judges. So with all of that in mind, I want to take us to a table talk. If these people, these leaders, these unlikely candidates for leadership were in our churches today, would there be a place for them to lead? Or maybe do you think that the only reason they were chosen for ministry is because the people who were fit for leadership did not respond to God's call? What do you think? All right, so we're covering the story of Deborah from Judges chapter 4 and 5. This story follows the same pattern of sin cycle, but we have two authors giving us insight. Chapter 4 is written by the author of Judges as historical narrative, and this is the overriding genre that we see throughout the book of Judges. You'll remember that historical narrative tells us what did happen, not what should have happened. We have to look back at the laws given to the Israelites in Exodus through Deuteronomy to be able to judge whether the actions of the individuals were in line with Yahweh's commands. So I want to keep bringing up that point, that these judges are not necessarily individuals that should be held up as an example to follow. We have to use some discernment in how we apply these lessons to our lives. And then chapter 5 was written by Deborah, our judge, who was leading Israel at the time. And Deborah, I'll remind you, is also a prophet and a spiritual leader. And she writes her version in the form of a song. These two chapters tell us the same story, but from a different angle and in a different genre, where chapter 4 gives us the detailed storyline. Chapter 5 gives us more of a theological insight to what was happening. This is very unique to the book of Judges. I've really enjoyed these chapters, and I hope you'll take some time maybe this week to read through chapters 4 and 5 on your own, because we won't be able to cover the whole section today. But for now, we are going to read through the story in chapter 4, starting in verse 1, going through 17. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud had died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his forces was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth of the nations. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord because he had 900 chariots of iron, and he harshly oppressed them 20 years. Deborah, a woman who was a prophetess and the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. It was her custom to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her for judgment. She summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "Hasn't the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, 'Go, deploy the troops on Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the Naphtalites and the Zebulunites? Then I will lure Sisera, commander of Jabin's forces, his chariots and his army at the Wadi Kishon to fight against you, and I will hand him over to you." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." "I will go with you," she said, "but you will receive no honor on the road you are about to take, because the Lord will sell Sisera into a woman's hand." So Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Now Heber, the Kenite, had moved away from the Kenites. The sons of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law, had pitched his tent beside the oak tree of Zaanannim, which was near Kadesh. It was reported to Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up Mount Tabor. Sisera summoned all his 900 chariots and all the people who were with him from Harosheth of the nations to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Move on, for this is the day the Lord has handed Sisera over to you. Hasn't the Lord gone before you?" So Barak came down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord threw Sisera, all his charioteers, and all his army into confusion with the sword before Barak. Sisera left his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth of the nations, and the whole army of Sisera fell by the sword. Not a single man was left. Meanwhile, Sisera had fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was peace between Jabin and the family of Heber the Kenite. All right, that was a lot to take in. Maybe take a minute in our table talk and discuss what stood out to you in this story. Okay, well, with all of that information that we just took in from chapter 4, it can be hard to understand what's really going on here. So I want to bring up a map for some further insights. We see King Jabin all the way in the north, and Barak is very close to where King Jabin is located. Sisera is strategically located in the middle. Verse 3 of our text tells us that Sisera harshly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. So we can assume that he was good at his job. He knew how to position his troops so that he could maintain control, and that's what he did. Chapter 5 affirms this by telling us that the main roads were deserted, that travelers had to keep to the side roads. In other words, it wasn't safe for people to be out. So let's turn to chapter 5, verse 7 and 8. Villages were deserted. They were deserted in Israel until I, Deborah, arose like a mother in Israel. Israel chose new gods. Then war was in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. I love this passage. After the author of Judges has introduced Deborah in chapter 4, Deborah's name means light and fire. So the reader is supposed to kind of see those titles, a woman of light and fire, in that sequence of Deborah, a leader, a prophet. And Deborah in chapter 5, she self-identifies as being like a mother. One of the commentators I read described Deborah as basically being like the Pope, the President, and Rambo all rolled into one. But Deborah says, I was like a mother. And we see Deborah all the way down near Jericho and what we know as the Dead Sea. And in chapter 4, verse 6, she summoned Barak. And I can almost hear that mama bear tone in her voice. You know, that's enough. You come here. Hasn't Yahweh commanded you? Go, deploy the troops. I will hand Sisera's army over to you. This retelling of Barak's call to action is such a stark contrast to Othniel, our model judge from chapter 3. If you'll remember, for Othniel, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and he judged Israel, and Othniel went out to battle. But then now we have Barak's story, and it sounds as though the Lord may have already called Barak to go out to battle, but Barak needed a spiritual leader to come alongside of him and to give him some extra encouragement. Let's go to another table talk. What are some ways that we can spur one another to following God's call? Now, I don't want to leave you with a totally negative view of Barak, although you can maintain that view if you'd like, because we do find out in our text that once he is assured that this is Yahweh's plan to deliver Israel, he says, okay, I am all in, even if it is at great risk to me, and even if I do not receive any glory, I will go. But Deborah, I need you there as an assurance that Yahweh is on our side. That was Barak's response to Yahweh's leading. Now let's contrast that with Heber, the Kenite, from verse 11 and 17. Heber had moved away from the Kenites and pitched his tent near Kadesh. I'm summarizing. If you remember earlier in our study, we learned that the Kenites were connected with the tribe of Judah. But the tribe of Judah is all the way in the south, even more south than where Deborah was located. And yet Heber is moving way north, right near Canaanite headquarters. Then we find out in verse 17, there was peace between Jabin and the family of Heber. Aha! So first we find out that Heber has moved geographically away from God's people. Then we find out that he has moved spiritually and morally away from God's covenant. I think it's safe to say that Heber made peace with Jabin because he thought there would be something of value in it for him, be it financial or power or protection, we don't know. But this is important, this contrast between Heber's attitude and Barak's attitude, where Barak's actions say, I will serve the Lord no matter the cost. Heber's actions say, I will pursue my benefit no matter who I serve. I can almost hear Joshua's words echoing through this story. As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. Then we come to the battle scene. So Barak and Deborah have managed to muster 10,000 men from the tribes of Israel. And as soon as Sisera hears this, that they've gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summons his army, his 900 chariots and all of his other men to this very place that Yahweh had promised to lure him back in verse 7. Now you might think that the Israelites having 10,000 men versus 900 chariots, it couldn't be that bad. But having chariots in this early stage of the Iron Age was a huge technological advantage to Sisera. Each chariot could hold multiple soldiers, employing one soldier for steering and the other soldiers for shooting and firing weapons at their enemy. Now, let's not forget that Sisera's army was an army, and they were an undefeated army at this point, and that they're armed like an army. They're trained like an army. We read Deborah's recount in chapter 5, verse 8, that the Israelites were volunteers and that there was not a shield or spear among them. So what did they use? They were completely reliant on Yahweh to do the heavy lifting, but they were willing to go. They were willing to follow Yahweh's lead despite the cost. Sisera plans to stamp out this rebellion, no problem. He has all his resources lined up. He's got his army positioned in the optimal terrain so that his chariots can ride fast. And the weather forecast is sunny and dry, which is perfect for a battle. Let's read what happens in chapter 5, verse 2 through 5. This is Deborah speaking. When the leaders lead in Israel, when the people volunteer, praise the Lord. Listen, kings, pay attention, princes. I will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. Lord, when you came from Seir, when you marched from the fields of Edom, the earth trembled. The heavens poured rain, and the clouds poured water. The mountains melted before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. So did you catch that? The God of Israel came from Seir of Edom. Deborah is connecting for us Mount Seir with the scene at Mount Sinai. Everybody knew what the story of Yahweh at Mount Sinai, but they were not expecting Yahweh to show up at Mount Seir. That was Canaanite territory. That's where they worshipped Baal. They were expecting Baal to show up at Mount Seir. In chapter 4, we read that Sisera and his army were confused. And then in chapter 5, we find out what they're confused about. It's because Baal is the god of weather. He's supposed to be the god of the storm. Sisera and his army would have likely called upon Baal for favor before going into battle. And when Sisera is bringing out his chariots to battle, do you think he would bring them out if he thought it was going to rain? Not a chance. His wheels and his horses would be totally bogged down in the mud if it rained. But that's exactly what happened. The heavens poured rain. And Deborah is showing us that this story is not just about the defeat of an oppressive ruler. This is about taking down the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. We end this portion of our story with Sisera fleeing on foot. In other words, his chariots were useless to save him. He's a coward, and he is taking refuge in the hand of a woman. This is a callback to Deborah's prophecy in chapter 4, verse 9. And we'll pick up the story here next week. But before we close, I just want to highlight one more thing that we've covered today. This story has been written in a chiastic structure. I'll give you a little refresher on what that means. If we were writing this story, we would save the main point for last, right? If A and B, then C. But in ancient literature, when they really want to drive home a point, they write it in a chiasm, and that goes A, B, C, B, A, where C is the main point. So in this story, we have two women, Deborah and Jael. Jael, we'll talk about her more next week. Then two men, Barak and Sisera. And then we have the hinge point of the story, the focal point, in chapter 4, verse 14, where Barak and Deborah are standing, looking down the mountain at Sisera's undefeated army. And Deborah says, "Move on, for this is the day the Lord has handed Sisera over to you. Hasn't the Lord gone before you?" Deborah saw this battle through a very different lens than the other characters. She did not look at the battle before them and see 900 insurmountable chariots. She saw a heavenly war with Yahweh as the hero. The Message translates Deborah's words in this way: charge, charge. This very day, God has given you victory over Sisera. Isn't God marching before you? Do you hear what she's saying? It is finished. The battle is already won. Church, I hope you will take some time for some meditation and reflection at this final table talk. What are the 900 chariots in your life that appear overwhelming and unbeatable? Does Deborah's story offer you any insights into your own spiritual battles? And please take some time to pray for one another. God bless you.